I suppose every girl dreams of the moment when a handsome man gets down on one knee in front of hundreds of people, presenting a ring that catches the light like captured starlight, declaring his love in words that make the entire room hold its breath in collective anticipation of her answer. But standing there in the center of the Valentino family's ballroom, with Christian's hopeful eyes looking up at me, and that 3-carat diamond glittering on my trembling hand, all I could feel was the suffocating weight of a gaze that burned into my skin like a brand, making every nerve ending in my body scream that something was terribly, dangerously wrong. The applause that erupted around us sounded distant, muffled, as if I were underwater and drowning slowly while everyone else celebrated on the surface, oblivious to the fact that I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except feel the intensity of those eyes watching me from somewhere in this sea of expensive suits and designer gowns, tracking my every movement like a predator deciding the exact moment to strike. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing in a mansion that probably cost more than my entire neighborhood, wearing a dress that Christian had insisted on buying for me despite my protests that it was too much, too expensive, too everything, I would have laughed at the absolute impossibility of it all. Because 6 months ago I was just Isabeau Moretti, though everyone called me Belle, and I was drowning in a completely different way, suffocating under the weight of student debt and medical bills that grew larger every single day, like some kind of malicious living thing that fed on my desperation and fear. My father had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the kind of diagnosis that doctors deliver with sympathy in their eyes because they know they're essentially handing you a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology and the experimental treatments that might, just might, give him a few more months or even years were so far beyond our financial reach that I had actually laughed when the oncologist mentioned them. A harsh, bitter sound that made my mother flinch, and my father reached for my hand with fingers that had grown thin and fragile. I had been working double shifts at the upscale art gallery in Manhattan, the kind of place where people bought paintings that cost more than I'd make in 5 years, where I smiled at wealthy patrons and pretended that my feet didn't ache in the heels I'd bought at a thrift store, and that my stomach wasn't cramping from skipping meals to save money for Dad's prescriptions. And that's where Christian Valentino walked into my life like something out of a romance novel, all charming smiles and expensive cologne, and an interest in a bronze sculpture that I suspected he didn't actually care about, but was using as an excuse to talk to me. He was handsome in that obvious, easy way that some men are, with warm brown eyes and perfectly styled dark hair, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having worried about money or security, or whether you can afford to eat lunch. And he pursued me with a determination that was flattering and overwhelming in equal measure, showing up at the gallery every few days with elaborate excuses about needing art consultation for his apartment, sending flowers to my tiny studio with notes that made me blush, asking me out for dinner at restaurants where I had to Google the dress code because I'd never been anywhere that required more than jeans and a nice top. I should have known something was off when he never seemed bothered by my constant cancellations, the times I had to leave dates early because the hospital called about Dad, the way I was always exhausted and distracted and definitely not the carefree girl he probably usually dated. But Christian just smiled that easy smile and told me he'd wait, that he understood, that family was important. And after 3 months of persistent pursuit, I finally let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, something good was happening in my life for once, that maybe I deserved something beautiful, even while everything else was falling apart. He didn't tell me about his family, not really, just vague mentions of family business and complicated dynamics that I assumed meant typical wealthy family drama, maybe some corporate rivalry or inheritance issues, the kind of problems that seemed ridiculous and trivial compared to watching your father waste away in a hospital bed. And I was too exhausted and too grateful for the distraction to push for details I thought didn't matter. Then the miracle happened. Or at least, that's what I thought it was at the time, when Dad's oncologist called to say that a spot had opened up in the experimental trial program that had previously been full, and even more miraculously, an anonymous donor had stepped forward to cover the costs, every single penny of the treatment that might save his life. And I had cried in that doctor's office with huge, gasping sobs of relief that I'd been holding back for months. believing that maybe God or the universe or whatever force controlled these things had finally decided to show us some mercy. 2 weeks later, I received a notification that half of my student loans had been paid off by an organization I'd never heard of. Something about a grant for students in financial hardship. And then Dad was transferred to the best cancer treatment facility in the entire state. A place I'd only read about in articles about where celebrities and politicians received care. And my mother called me crying, because the care coordinator had assured her that everything was covered, absolutely everything. And I remember thinking that our luck had finally turned, that maybe everything was going to be okay after all. Christian proposed on a Tuesday evening in his family's ballroom, at what he'd told me was just a small family, gathering to finally introduce me properly to everyone who mattered in his life. Though small apparently meant 200 people in formal wear drinking champagne that probably cost more per bottle than my monthly rent. And I had felt so out of place in the designer dress Christian had sent to my apartment, with a note insisting I wear it. Surrounded by women dripping in jewelry that could fund entire college educations, and men who exuded the kind of power that made the air feel different when they entered a room. I had been talking to Christian's mother, an elegant woman with kind eyes who seemed genuinely interested in my graduate studies in art history, when suddenly the music stopped, and Christian was in front of me, getting down on one knee in the center of the dance floor, and everyone was watching. And he was saying beautiful words about fate and love and building a future together. And I should have been focusing on him, on this moment, on the question hanging in the air between us, but instead I felt it, that gaze, heavy and intense and possessive in a way that made my skin prickle with an awareness I didn't understand. I forced myself to look at Christian, to focus on his hopeful face and the ring box open in his hands, and I heard myself say yes because what else could I say in front of all these people? Because Christian had been kind to me when I needed kindness, because I was grateful and fond of him even if I wasn't sure what I felt was the kind of earth-shattering love that justified marriage. And the room erupted in applause and congratulations, and Christian was sliding the ring onto my finger and kissing me while cameras flashed and people cheered. But that feeling didn't go away. That sense of being watched, being hunted, being claimed by something I couldn't see but could feel in every cell of my body. Then the crowd parted. Not dramatically like in movies, but in that subtle way people move when someone important approaches, creating a path without seeming to realize they're doing it. And I looked up toward the grand staircase that curved down from the second floor and saw him for the first time. Really saw him. And my breath caught in my throat in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with recognition of something dangerous and magnetic, and utterly inevitable. Dante Valentino descended those stairs like a king approaching his throne, and I understood in that instant why people used words like commanding presence and natural authority, because he didn't just enter a space. He dominated it, claimed it, made every other person in the room seem somehow less substantial just by existing in proximity to him. He was taller than Christian, broader in the shoulders, with the same dark hair, but his was slightly longer, less carefully styled, falling across his forehead in a way that suggested he didn't particularly care about maintaining perfect appearance because he didn't need to, because his presence alone demanded attention and respect, and probably a healthy dose of fear. His face was harder than his brother's, all sharp angles and strong jaw, and a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. And when those dark eyes locked onto mine, I felt it like a physical impact, like being struck by lightning and somehow surviving, but knowing you'll never be quite the same afterward, knowing that something fundamental has shifted in your cellular structure, and there's no going back to who you were before. The applause died away into uncomfortable silence as Dante reached the bottom of the stairs and moved through the crowd with measured, purposeful steps. And I noticed that people moved out of his way much more quickly than they had for the wedding proposal spectacle, pressing back against walls and each other like they were afraid to accidentally brush against him. And Christian's hand on my waist tightened in a way that felt more possessive than reassuring, and I realized with a cold, sinking sensation in my stomach that Christian was afraid. actually genuinely afraid. And if he was afraid, then I should probably be terrified. Dante stopped directly in front of us, so close that I could smell his cologne. Something darker and more complex than Christian's, something with notes of leather and smoke and expensive whiskey. And he didn't look at his brother at all, didn't acknowledge the ring on my finger, or the proposal that had just happened, or the 200 witnesses watching this confrontation unfold. Instead, keeping his eyes fixed on mine, with an intensity that made me feel like he could see through every defense I'd ever constructed, every wall I'd built around the frightened, desperate parts of myself I didn't want anyone to see. When he finally spoke, his voice was deeper than Christian's, rough around the edges like smoke over gravel, and he addressed the entire room rather than us specifically, making sure everyone heard what he was about to say, making sure this moment would be witnessed and remembered and impossible to take back or deny. And his words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that I knew would spread far beyond this ballroom. He said, with absolute certainty and complete authority, with the weight of someone who had never had anyone successfully challenge his will, "There won't be a wedding. She's already taken by me." And the world seemed to tilt on its axis, everything I thought I understood about my life and my choices and my circumstances suddenly revealing itself to be nothing but carefully constructed illusion. And before I could process what was happening, before I could protest or question or even breathe, Dante's hand closed around my wrist in a grip that was firm without being painful, proprietary without being brutal. And he pulled me forward, away from Christian, away from the safe, easy future I thought I had just agreed to, and toward something darker and more dangerous and infinitely more complicated than I had ever imagined possible. The drive to Dante's estate passed in a blur of streetlights and stunned silence, with me sitting in the back of what I was fairly certain was a bulletproof Mercedes, my wrist still tingling from where his fingers had gripped it in that ballroom, my mind racing through the events of the past hour, like someone frantically rewinding a film, trying to find the exact moment where everything went catastrophically wrong, though I was beginning to suspect that the wrongness had started long before tonight, that I had been swimming in dangerous waters for months, without realizing that sharks circled beneath the surface. Dante sat beside me, not touching me now, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that his presence filled the entire car, despite the spacious interior. And every time I opened my mouth to demand an explanation, or hurl accusations, or simply scream at the absolute insanity of what had just happened, I would glance at his profile, at the hard line of his jaw, and the cold control in his expression, and the words would die in my throat because some primitive part of my brain recognized that I was in the presence of an apex predator, and making the wrong move could be catastrophic. The estate, when we finally arrived, was exactly the kind of place I should have expected from a man like Dante Valentino. All towering iron gates and manicured grounds, and a mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from some European countryside, sitting on a cliff overlooking the Hudson River, with views that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. And as we pulled up the circular driveway, I noticed the security cameras positioned at strategic intervals, the subtle bulges under the jackets of the men standing near the entrance, the way every single person we passed looked at Dante with a mixture of respect and fear that made my stomach clench with the realization that I had stepped into a world I didn't understand and had no idea how to navigate. He led me inside without a word, through a foyer with marble floors and a chandelier that could probably pay off the rest of my student debt, down a hallway lined with what looked like original Renaissance paintings that definitely should have been in a museum, and finally into a study that was all dark wood and leather furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the glittering Manhattan skyline in the distance, and it was only when he closed the door behind us, sealing us in this space together, that I finally found my voice and my fury. I whirled on him, 6 months of confusion and fear and desperation crystallizing into white-hot anger that burned away the shock and the intimidation. And I demanded to know what gave him the right to treat me like property, To drag me away from his own brother's proposal like I was some kind of possession to be claimed, to announce to an entire room of people that I belonged to him when I had never even spoken to him before tonight. When I didn't know him, and certainly hadn't agreed to be his anything. And my voice rose with each accusation until I was practically shouting. And through it all, Dante just stood there watching me with those dark, unreadable eyes, letting me rage and rant and exhaust myself against his complete and utter calm, like waves breaking against an immovable cliff. When I finally ran out of words and breath, standing there trembling with anger and something else I didn't want to name, something that felt dangerously like attraction mixed with terror, he moved to the bar cart in the corner and poured 2 glasses of what looked like very expensive scotch, and he brought one to me with the kind of casual grace that suggested he was utterly unconcerned with my fury, completely confident that by the end of this conversation, I would understand exactly how thoroughly I had already been caught in his carefully constructed trap. He told me to sit, not as a request, but as a simple statement of what would happen next, and I wanted to refuse out of pure spite, wanted to maintain my defiance and my righteous anger. But my legs were shaking, and I couldn't seem to catch my breath, and the scotch glass was cool against my palm, so I found myself sinking into one of the leather armchairs while he remained standing, positioning himself between me and the door, in a way that might have been accidental but felt distinctly like a deliberate choice, a reminder that I was here because he allowed it, and I would leave when he permitted it, and not a moment before. He began to speak then, his voice low and measured, explaining with the kind of chilling composure that made it clear he had planned every word of this conversation long before tonight, that from the moment Christian had brought me to a family dinner 3 months ago, casually introducing me as the girl he was seeing, Dante had known that I was different from the usual women his brother dated, that I wasn't some shallow socialite looking for access to wealth and status, that I had depth and intelligence and a genuine quality that was rare in their world, and I wanted to interrupt, to tell him that his assessment of my character didn't give him ownership of my choices, but something in his expression kept me silent, kept me listening, even as every word he spoke felt like a revelation I desperately didn't want to hear. He told me that he had investigated me, said it as casually as someone might mention checking the weather, and my blood ran cold as he recounted details about my life that I had never shared with Christian. Details about my father's diagnosis and the impossible cost of treatment, about my mother working double shifts as a nurse to try to make ends meet, about the collection agencies that called at all hours demanding payment on medical bills that had grown to 6 figures, about my own student debt that had kept me from sleeping at night as I tried to figure out how to finish my graduate degree while working enough hours to survive. And with each detail he revealed, I felt the walls of reality shifting around me, felt the ground beneath my feet turning to quicksand as I began to understand that nothing about the past 6 months had been coincidence or luck or divine intervention. The anonymous donor who had covered my father's experimental treatment, the mysterious grant that had paid off half my student loans, the miraculous opening in the trial program that had previously been full, the transfer to the elite cancer facility where my father was currently receiving world-class care. Every single piece of good fortune that had felt like salvation had been Dante, pulling strings from the shadows, building an invisible cage around me bar by bar while I was too desperate and grateful to question where the help was coming from, or what price I might eventually have to pay for it. I felt sick, actually physically nauseated, as the full scope of his manipulation became clear, as I realized that he had been orchestrating my life for months, while I remained completely oblivious, believing that I was making my own choices and finding my own path when in reality I had been dancing to music only he could hear, following a script he had written, without ever knowing I was performing in his private play. He moved closer then, crouching down in front of my chair so that we were at eye level, so that I couldn't look away from those dark eyes that seemed to see through every defense I possessed. And he asked me if I understood what he was telling me, if I comprehended the full implications of the debt I had already incurred without realizing it. Because in his world, in the world he controlled with ruthless efficiency, Nothing came for free, and every favor carried a price that would eventually come due. And that price, he explained with devastating clarity, was me, all of me, my loyalty and my presence, and ultimately my complete surrender to the reality that I belonged to him now, whether I liked it or not. I wanted to throw the scotch in his face, wanted to tell him that human beings couldn't be owned like property regardless of how much money he had spent or how many strings he had pulled. Wanted to insist that I would find a way to pay back every penny and walk away from both Valentino brothers and their twisted family dynamics. But even as the words formed in my mind, I knew they were empty threats, knew that I was trapped as surely as if he had locked me in an actual cage, because he held my father's life in his hands, and my mother's peace of mind, and my own ability to finish my education and build any kind of future. And we both knew that I couldn't walk away from that, couldn't sacrifice my family's well-being for the sake of pride or principle or the illusion of freedom. He presented his terms then, laying them out with the precision of a business negotiation, explaining that I could refuse him and watch everything he had provided disappear overnight. Could watch my father get kicked out of the elite treatment facility and lose access to the experimental drugs that were actually working. Could watch my mother collapse under the weight of medical debt that would return with a vengeance. Could return to working double shifts and skipping meals and lying awake at night wondering if my father would die because I couldn't afford to save him, or I could accept reality and agree to become his in every way that mattered. And in return, he would continue to provide everything I needed, would clear the rest of my debts, and ensure my family never wanted for anything, and give me access to a life of luxury I had never imagined possible. The choice he offered wasn't really a choice at all, and we both knew it. But there was something almost respectful in how he laid it out. How he didn't try to pretend this was about love or romance or anything other than exactly what it was, a transaction in which I traded my autonomy for my family's survival, and in some twisted way I appreciated the honesty of it even as I hated everything it represented. I asked him what would happen to Christian, whether his brother would be punished for falling for the woman Dante had apparently already claimed, and something flickered in Dante's expression then. Something that might have been regret or pain, or possibly just annoyance. And he told me that Christian would be fine as long as he accepted the reality of the situation. That this wasn't about punishing his brother, but about claiming what was rightfully his. Though he didn't elaborate on what made me rightfully his beyond the money he had invested in keeping my family afloat. And I wondered if perhaps there was more to this obsession than simple possession, if maybe there was something deeper and more dangerous lurking beneath his calculated control. I found myself asking the question that had been burning in my mind since he dragged me out of that ballroom, demanding to know why me specifically. What about me had caught his attention and triggered this elaborate manipulation? Whether this was just some kind of power play between brothers, or if there was something more. And Dante's expression shifted into something I couldn't quite read. Something intense and almost vulnerable for just a fraction of a second before his control slammed back into place. He told me that I reminded him of someone from a long time ago who had been genuine in a world full of performers, someone who had seen him as a person, rather than a position or a source of power. And I wanted to ask who that someone was and what happened to them. But before I could form the question, he was standing again, putting distance between us. And the moment of whatever that vulnerability had been was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating man who had orchestrated my entire life without my knowledge or consent. The scotch burned going down my throat as I drained the glass in one desperate swallow, needing the fire of it to ground me in this surreal reality I was suddenly inhabiting. And I told Dante that I would accept his terms, but that I had conditions of my own. Because if I was going to be trapped in this arrangement, then I refused to be a passive prisoner. Refused to be just another beautiful possession in his collection of expensive things. And I saw something like surprise flicker across his features, as if he hadn't expected me to negotiate, as if he had assumed I would simply crumble under the weight of his manipulation. I told him I wanted to continue my graduate studies, wanted to maintain some semblance of the life I had been building for myself. wanted to understand the world he was forcing me into rather than existing in ignorant captivity. And I demanded that if I was going to be his, then he needed to teach me everything, needed to show me the truth of the Valentino family business and stop treating me like a sheltered child who needed to be protected from reality. And as I spoke, I watched his expression shift from surprise to something that looked almost like respect, maybe even admiration, as if I had passed some kind of test I hadn't known I was taking. He agreed to my terms with a single nod, that was all. Just a slight inclination of his head that somehow carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. And he told me that starting tomorrow I would shadow him, would attend his meetings and learn the intricacies of his empire, would be given access to knowledge that could get me killed if I ever betrayed him. And the way he said it, with absolute certainty that I wouldn't betray him, made me wonder if he knew something about me that I didn't know about myself, if he had seen some darkness in my soul that matched his own, and that was what had drawn his attention in the first place. He walked me to the door then, his hand settling on the small of my back in a gesture that was possessive but not aggressive, proprietary but somehow also protective. And he told me that a car would pick me up at 8 a.m. and that I should dress professionally, because I would be meeting people who would judge me based on appearance before they ever heard me speak. And I wanted to protest that I didn't have professional clothes suitable for whatever world he inhabited. But before I could say anything, he added that a stylist would arrive at my apartment at 6 a.m. to help me prepare, because of course he had already thought of everything, had already anticipated every obstacle and smoothed the path ahead because that was what he did. He controlled everything and everyone around him with meticulous precision. As I rode home in another luxury car, driven by a silent man, who probably carried at least 2 weapons I couldn't see, I stared out at the city lights and tried to process the fact that my entire life had been rewritten in the space of a few hours, that the future I had thought I was building with Christian had been nothing but smoke and mirrors, that I had been claimed by a man I didn't know but who apparently knew everything about me. And the most terrifying part wasn't the loss of freedom or the manipulation, or even the danger I sensed hovering around Dante like a physical presence, but rather the tiny, traitorous part of myself that had felt something when he looked at me with those dark, intense eyes. Something that wasn't fear or anger, but rather recognition, as if some deep part of me had been waiting for exactly this, for someone who saw through all my defenses and claimed me anyway. Someone dangerous enough to match the darkness I usually pretended didn't exist inside myself. And as I touched the diamond ring still glittering on my finger, Christian's ring that I should probably return but somehow couldn't bring myself to remove just yet, I wondered if Dante Valentino had just saved me or damned me, and whether there was really any difference between the two in the end. The stylist arrived at precisely 6 a.m. as promised. A severe-looking woman named Margot, who swept into my tiny studio apartment with an entourage of assistants carrying garment bags and makeup cases and shoe boxes, transforming my modest living space into something resembling a high-end salon. And she assessed me with the critical eye of someone evaluating raw material for a sculpture, circling me slowly while making thoughtful humming noises that I couldn't interpret as either approval or disappointment. She dressed me in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent, with a silk blouse the color of deep burgundy underneath, and heels that added 3 inches to my height, while somehow remaining comfortable enough to walk in, which I suspected was some kind of expensive shoe magic that only the wealthy had access to. And when she finally allowed me to look in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me, because she looked polished and powerful, and like she belonged in Dante Valentino's world in a way that the exhausted graduate student in thrift store clothes definitely had not. The car arrived exactly at 8, driven by the same silent man from the previous night, and as we navigated through morning traffic toward the financial district, I tried to calm the nervous energy thrumming through my veins, tried to prepare myself for whatever I was about to experience, though I had no frame of reference for what stepping into a mafia boss's daily operations would actually entail, because everything I knew about organized crime came from movies and television shows that I suspected bore little resemblance to reality. Dante's office occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper that housed what appeared to be a legitimate import-export business, at least according to the discreet signage in the lobby. And as we rode the elevator up to the executive level, I noticed the way other passengers instinctively moved away from my driver, creating space around us as if danger had a scent they could detect and avoid. And I wondered if I would eventually develop that same ability to recognize threat, or if I would always be fumbling blindly through this world Dante inhabited with such lethal grace. Dante was waiting in his office, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, and he turned when I entered, his dark eyes traveling over me in an assessment that felt almost physical, and I saw satisfaction flicker across his features before he gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his massive desk. He explained that today I would simply observe, that I should watch and listen and begin to understand the various threads that wove together to create his empire, and he emphasized that I should never speak unless directly addressed, that showing weakness or uncertainty in front of the men I was about to meet could be dangerous not just for me but for him, because any perceived vulnerability would be exploited by people who spent their entire lives looking for opportunities to gain advantage or seize power. And I nodded my understanding while my stomach twisted with anxiety about the world I was being initiated into, a world where every word and gesture carried weight and consequence. The first meeting involved 3 men in expensive suits who entered Dante's office with the kind of deference that suggested they feared him as much as they respected him, and they discussed shipping schedules and cargo manifests and distribution networks in language that sounded legitimate on the surface but carried undertones that made it clear we were discussing something significantly less legal than the import-export business claimed on paper. I watched Dante negotiate with cold precision, never raising his voice but somehow dominating the entire conversation through sheer force of presence, and I noticed how the other men's eyes would occasionally flicker to me with curiosity and calculation, trying to determine who I was and what I meant to their boss. And Dante's hand would settle possessively on my knee under the table whenever their attention lingered too long, a silent claim of ownership that made something in my stomach flutter despite my determination to remain unmoved by his displays of possession. The second meeting was significantly more tense, involving a man who owned a chain of legitimate businesses that apparently served as fronts for money laundering operations. And this man was angry about something, his voice rising as he complained about increased scrutiny from federal investigators and demanded that Dante do something to protect their mutual interests. I watched Dante's expression remain perfectly calm, even as the other man's agitation grew. And then, in a movement so fast I almost missed it, Dante had the man pressed against the window with one hand around his throat, explaining in a voice that never rose above conversational level that speaking to him with disrespect was a privilege no one possessed, that the federal investigation was the man's own problem caused by his sloppy bookkeeping and careless mistakes, and that if he couldn't handle the pressure of their business relationship, then perhaps it was time to dissolve that relationship permanently. And the way he said dissolve made it abundantly clear that he wasn't talking about a simple business termination. The man left looking significantly more subdued and probably bruised around the throat, and I sat there processing what I had just witnessed, understanding on a visceral level that Dante's reputation for ruthlessness wasn't exaggeration or posturing but simple fact, that he was capable of violence and intimidation, and probably much worse. And when he turned to me and asked if I was all right, if I needed a moment to process what I'd seen, I found myself saying no with more confidence than I felt, because some stubborn part of me refused to show weakness in front of him, refused to be the fragile thing that needed protecting from reality. Over the following days and weeks, I continued to shadow Dante through his various business operations, watching him navigate a complex web of legitimate enterprises and criminal activities with the skill of someone who had been born into this world and shaped by its brutal lessons. And I began to understand that his empire was far more sophisticated and far-reaching than I had initially comprehended, stretching from shipping operations to construction companies to entertainment venues, each serving multiple purposes and generating revenue through both legal and illegal channels. I watched him handle betrayals with swift and often brutal efficiency, saw him order punishments that ranged from financial ruin to physical violence, witnessed the absolute loyalty he commanded from his inner circle and the genuine fear he inspired in those who operated on the periphery of his organization. And through it all, I was trying to reconcile the man who could order someone's finger broken for skimming profits with the man who anonymously donated millions to children's hospitals and personally ensured that elderly neighborhood residents could afford their medications and protected certain businesses from other criminal operations that might prey on them. He was a study in contradictions, operating by a code of honor that made perfect sense within his world, even as it would seem incomprehensible to anyone outside it. And I found myself fascinated, despite my best intentions to remain emotionally distant, drawn to the complexity of him in ways that probably said something disturbing about my own character that I wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. The attraction between us grew more undeniable with each passing day, crackling in the air during long hours spent in close proximity, burning in the brief moments when his hand would settle on my lower back to guide me through a doorway, or when our eyes would meet across a conference table during tense negotiations, and I could feel him watching me constantly, his attention a tangible weight that followed my every movement. But Dante maintained an iron control that was almost more maddening than if he had simply acted on the desire I could see simmering in his dark eyes, because he never crossed the physical boundaries he had set, never pushed beyond possessive touches and heated looks. And when I finally demanded to know why, frustrated by the constant tension and the way my own body betrayed me with responses I didn't want to acknowledge, he told me that I needed to come to him willingly, rather than out of obligation or fear or the sense of debt that hung between us, that he wanted my surrender to be a choice I made consciously and completely, rather than something coerced by circumstances or manipulation. His answer should have reassured me, should have felt like respect for my autonomy, but instead it felt like another form of control, another way he was orchestrating my choices and reactions, because by refusing to simply take what he wanted, he was making me aware of wanting it too, was forcing me to confront the dark attraction I felt toward him and the way I had started to anticipate our time together, the way I caught myself watching the way he moved through the world with that predatory grace, the way his rare smiles felt like rewards I wanted to earn. I spent my evenings in my apartment trying to focus on my graduate thesis, attempting to maintain some connection to the life I had been building before Dante Valentino crashed through my carefully constructed reality. But I found my thoughts constantly drifting back to him, analyzing our interactions, replaying conversations, trying to understand the man beneath the fearsome reputation. And I was beginning to realize that he had been right about one thing, that I was already his, in ways that had nothing to do with debt or obligation, that some part of me had been claimed so thoroughly that I couldn't imagine existing outside his orbit anymore. Then Christian appeared at my apartment one evening without warning, looking haggard and desperate in a way that made my heart clench with guilt and sympathy. And he pleaded with me to run away with him, insisted that what Dante felt for me wasn't love but obsession, that his brother had a history of becoming fixated on things and people and consuming them until there was nothing left, and he promised that he could protect me, that he had resources and connections outside the family that would allow us to disappear and build the normal life together that we had been planning before Dante's dramatic intervention. I listened to his passionate appeals and felt the pull of the simpler future he was offering, the uncomplicated relationship we had been building before I understood the true nature of his family. And part of me wanted desperately to say yes, to choose the light over the darkness, to escape before I became so entangled in Dante's world that extraction would be impossible. But even as Christian spoke, I knew that I couldn't go with him, that something fundamental had shifted inside me during these weeks of shadowing Dante, of seeing the full scope of his power and control, of understanding the complexity of the empire he had built and maintained through intelligence and ruthlessness, and an unwavering commitment to his own code of honor. I told Christian as gently as I could that I couldn't run away with him, that I was sorry for the hurt I had caused and the confusion surrounding the situation, but that I had made my choice even if I didn't fully understand all the implications of that choice yet. And I watched his expression crumble from hope to devastation to something harder and angrier. And he told me that I was making a terrible mistake, that Dante would destroy me the way he destroyed everything he touched, that I would wake up one day and realize I had traded my soul for the illusion of security, and by then, it would be too late to get it back. His words haunted me after he left, echoing through my mind as I lay awake that night, wondering if he was right, if I was walking willingly into a trap that would close around me until I couldn't breathe, until I forgot who I had been before Dante Valentino decided I belonged to him. But even with those doubts swirling through my consciousness, I knew I wouldn't change my decision, that whatever Dante and I were building together, however dark and dangerous and probably unhealthy it might be, felt more real and more essential than the safe alternative Christian offered. The following week brought news that made my blood run cold. Whispered conversations between Dante's men that they didn't realize I could overhear. Fragments of information about Christian making contact with rival families, about meetings in neutral territories, about alliances being formed that didn't make strategic sense unless the goal was something specific and personal rather than broadly business-oriented. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, tried to convince myself that Christian wouldn't be so reckless as to actually move against his own brother. But the worried glances Dante's closest advisors kept shooting in my direction suggested they believed otherwise, that they saw me as the catalyst for a family rupture that could have devastating consequences for everyone involved. And I felt guilt settle heavy in my chest at the realization that my presence had created this conflict, that both brothers were apparently willing to risk everything over possession of me. I debated whether to tell Dante about Christian's visit, about his plea for me to run away with him, knowing that the information could be important, but also knowing that it might trigger exactly the kind of confrontation that could tear the family apart. And I spent days wrestling with the decision, weighing loyalty against protection, trying to determine where my responsibilities lay in this impossible situation. Then I overheard something that made the choice for me. A conversation between two of Dante's lower-level associates about a meeting scheduled at the old warehouse on the docks, about how it was supposed to be a neutral negotiation to settle some territorial dispute. But something felt wrong about it, about how the usual security protocols weren't being followed, and certain key players were being kept deliberately uninformed, and a cold certainty settled in my gut that Christian's desperate love had transformed into something far more dangerous, that his new allies weren't interested in helping him win me back, but rather in using his pain and anger as a tool to strike at Dante himself. I found Dante in his office late that evening, tie loosened and sleeves rolled up as he reviewed financial reports that probably concealed various illegal transactions within seemingly legitimate business operations. And when I told him what I had overheard, when I explained my suspicions about Christian's involvement and the potential trap waiting at the warehouse meeting, I watched his expression shift through several emotions too quickly to fully identify before settling into cold fury, mixed with what might have been grief. He asked me why I was telling him this, whether I was trying to protect him or trying to protect Christian. And I found myself being honest in a way I hadn't been since this whole situation began, admitting that I was trying to protect everyone because despite the impossible circumstances and the manipulation and the way I had been dragged into a world I didn't understand, I had somehow started to care about all of them, about Dante with his contradictions and his intensity and his surprising moments of tenderness, about Christian who had shown me kindness when I desperately needed it, even if that kindness had been part of a larger game I hadn't known I was playing, even about the family itself with all its violence and complexity and twisted sense of loyalty. Dante studied me for a long moment, his dark eyes searching my face for something I couldn't name, and then he told me that I would accompany him to the warehouse meeting, that if there was going to be a confrontation with his brother, then I should be there to see the consequences of the choices I had made, the ripples spreading out from my presence in their lives, and I wanted to argue that I shouldn't be anywhere near what might turn into a violent situation. But something in his expression told me this wasn't up for debate, that he needed me there for reasons that went beyond simple presence, that maybe he needed to know if I would stand with him when everything fell apart, or if I would try to run to Christian at the first sign of genuine danger. The warehouse was exactly the kind of place where bad things happened in movies, all rusted, metal and broken windows and shadows that seemed to move with malicious intent. And as we arrived with a small contingent of Dante's most trusted men, I could feel the wrongness in the air, the sense that we were walking into something carefully orchestrated and deliberately deadly. And when the shooting started mere seconds after we entered the building, when bullets began tearing through the darkness, and men were shouting, and I could smell gunpowder and see muzzle flashes illuminating the chaos like deadly fireworks, I understood with crystalline clarity that this was the reality of Dante's world, stripped of all pretense and sophistication, that underneath the expensive suits and legitimate business fronts and carefully maintained appearances, violence was always waiting just beneath the surface, ready to erupt and consume everything in its path. I saw Dante moving through the chaos with practiced efficiency, returning fire while simultaneously directing his men into defensive positions, and I watched one of the attackers line up a shot that would have caught Dante in the back of the head, would have ended him before he even knew the threat was there. And I didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't consider the consequences or question my own actions. I just moved, throwing myself forward and feeling the bullet that was meant for him tear through my shoulder instead. And the pain was immediate and overwhelming, fire spreading through my entire body as I fell and heard Dante roaring my name with something that sounded like anguish. And the last thing I saw before darkness took me was his face above mine, his hands pressed against my wound trying to stop the bleeding, and his eyes filled with an emotion so raw and devastating that it finally, irrevocably, answered every question I had ever had about what I meant to him and what he was willing to risk to keep me. I woke to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the steady beeping of medical equipment. My shoulder, throbbing with a pain that felt like someone had poured molten metal into my veins and let it solidify around the bone. And the first thing I saw when I managed to force my eyes open was Dante sitting in a chair beside my hospital bed, his suit jacket discarded and his white shirt stained with what I realized with a distant sort of horror was my blood, dried to a rusty brown that looked almost black in the dim lighting. His head was in his hands, elbows resting on his knees, in a posture of absolute defeat that I had never seen from him before. This man who always stood so straight and commanded every room he entered with unwavering confidence. And when he finally sensed my movement and looked up, the raw devastation in his eyes took my breath away more effectively than any bullet could have, because I was seeing him completely unguarded for the first time, seeing past every defense and carefully maintained control to the terrified man underneath who had apparently been sitting vigil beside my bed for what the clock on the wall suggested was at least 12 hours. He moved to my side immediately, his hand finding mine with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible from someone capable of the violence I had witnessed. And his voice when he spoke was hoarse, wrecked, asking me why I had done it, why I had thrown myself in front of a bullet meant for him when I should have stayed back where it was safe, when I should have let him handle the situation the way he had handled countless others before, and I wanted to explain that I hadn't made a conscious decision, hadn't weighed options or calculated outcomes, that I had simply seen him in danger and reacted with an instinct I didn't know I possessed, an instinct that apparently valued his life more than my own safety. But my throat was too dry and my thoughts too scattered from whatever pain medication they had me on. So instead I just squeezed his hand and tried to convey through that simple touch everything I couldn't yet put into words. The doctor came in then, a nervous-looking man who kept glancing at Dante with barely concealed fear, and he explained that the bullet had gone clean through my shoulder, missing any major arteries or bones, but causing significant muscle damage that would require physical therapy and time to heal properly. And he emphasized that I had been extraordinarily lucky, that a few inches in any direction, and the outcome could have been catastrophically different. and I watched Dante's jaw clench as the doctor spoke. Watched his free hand curl into a fist so tight that his knuckles went white. And I knew he was thinking about all the ways this could have gone worse. All the possibilities where I didn't wake up at all. After the doctor left, promising to return with discharge papers and care instructions, Dante finally spoke about what had happened after I lost consciousness. His voice carefully controlled, but with an undercurrent of rage that made the air feel charged with violence barely contained. And he told me that his men had neutralized the attackers, that the warehouse ambush had been orchestrated by a rival family called the Rossis, who had apparently seen the conflict between Dante and Christian as an opportunity to eliminate both brothers and seize control of Valentino territory, and that Christian had been played by people far more dangerous and calculating than he had realized, used as a pawn in a game he didn't understand by men who had no intention of letting him survive once his usefulness ended. Dante explained that they had found Christian during the raid, tied up in a back room where he had apparently been held after his new allies revealed their true intentions, and his brother had been forced to watch the ambush unfold, had seen me take the bullet meant for Dante, and had apparently broken down completely, finally understanding the full scope of his mistakes and the consequences of his desperate attempt to reclaim what he thought he had lost. And I felt something twist in my chest at the image of Christian witnessing the violence his actions had inadvertently set in motion, watching me bleed because of choices he had made in anger and heartbreak. Dante's hand tightened on mine as he continued, telling me that in that moment when he saw me fall, when he watched my blood spreading across the warehouse floor and thought he might lose me before he ever had the chance to truly claim me, something had broken inside him. Some last barrier of control that he had maintained throughout his entire life, and he admitted with devastating honesty that he had torn through the remaining attackers with a violence that shocked even his own men, that he had ended the threat with brutal efficiency, and then carried me to his car himself, refusing to wait for an ambulance, driving through the city at speeds that probably should have killed us both, while one of his men pressed towels against my wound and tried to keep me conscious. And his voice cracked as he described holding me and begging me not to leave him, promising things he had never promised anyone, making bargains with God or the universe or whatever power might be listening that he would give anything, sacrifice anything, if I would just keep breathing. He told me then, with my blood still staining his shirt, and my hand held carefully in his, as if I were made of glass that might shatter at any moment, that he had been in love with me from the moment Christian first brought me to meet the family, that watching me smile at his brother's jokes and listening to me speak passionately about art history and seeing the genuine kindness in how I treated even the servers and staff at that dinner had awakened something in him he thought had died years ago, when this life had stripped away his capacity for softness and vulnerability. He confessed that claiming me so dramatically at the proposal had been an act of desperation rather than calculation, that he had stood on that balcony watching Christian offer me a future, and realized that he couldn't let it happen, couldn't stand by and watch me slip away into a life that didn't include him. Even if his interference made him a villain in my eyes, even if I hated him for destroying the simple happiness I might have found with his brother. Because the alternative, a world where I belonged to someone else and he had to witness it from a distance, was more unbearable than any hatred I might direct toward him. I lay there processing his confession, understanding finally that this had never been about power or possession or winning some kind of contest with Christian, that Dante's manipulation and control and orchestration of my circumstances had been the actions of a man desperately in love, but fundamentally unable to express or pursue that love through normal means, shaped by a life where everything was a negotiation and everyone had a price and vulnerability was a weapon others would use to destroy you. The woman I had been 6 months ago, the exhausted graduate student just trying to save her father and survive another day, would have been horrified by this revelation, would have run screaming from a man whose love manifested as control and whose affection came wrapped in manipulation and threat. But the woman I had become through weeks of shadowing him, of seeing the full complexity of who he was, and what he had built. Of understanding that his darkness was matched by unexpected moments of genuine care and protection. That woman found herself reaching up with her uninjured arm to pull him closer, found herself whispering that she understood, that somewhere in the process of being claimed by him, she had started claiming him right back, that taking a bullet for him hadn't been sacrifice but instinct born from feelings she had been trying desperately not to acknowledge. Dante kissed me then, finally closing the distance he had maintained for weeks, and it was nothing like I had imagined, not aggressive or dominating, but almost reverent, as if he was afraid I might disappear if he wasn't careful, as if I was something precious and fragile that he had nearly lost, and couldn't quite believe he was being allowed to touch. And I kissed him back with all the confused emotion and undeniable attraction and reluctant affection that had been building since that night in the ballroom when he had first laid claim to me in front of 200 witnesses. And I tasted salt and realized that one of us was crying, though I couldn't tell if it was him or me or both of us releasing the tension of almost losing each other before we had even begun. The recovery period passed in a strange blur of pain medication and physical therapy, and gradually returning strength, with Dante hovering constantly, driving his staff and my doctors to distraction with his demands for updates and his insistence on personally overseeing every aspect of my care, and I discovered that a man who commanded an empire with ruthless efficiency became almost comically overprotective when faced with someone he loved being injured, fussing over pillows and medications, and whether I was comfortable in a way that would have been annoying if it hadn't been so transparently born from genuine fear of losing me. Christian came to see me once during those weeks, looking hollow and aged in a way that had nothing to do with physical time passing, and everything to do with the weight of guilt and regret that he now carried. And we talked for hours about choices and consequences, and the impossibility of knowing which path would lead to happiness, and which would lead to destruction. And I forgave him, because I understood that his actions, however misguided and dangerous, had come from a place of genuine feeling. And he told me that he was leaving New York, accepting a position managing Valentino interests in Chicago, where he could rebuild himself away from the constant reminder of what he had lost and what his desperation had nearly cost everyone he cared about. I watched him leave with a strange mixture of relief and melancholy, understanding that this chapter was closing, and that whatever came next would be built on very different foundations than the simple romance we had been attempting to construct before Dante's intervention. And part of me would always wonder about the life I might have had if I had never attended that family dinner. If Dante had never seen me and decided I was worth claiming. If I had married Christian and remained blissfully ignorant of the darker currents flowing beneath the surface of their world. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would never have been truly happy in that alternative reality, that some essential part of myself had been sleeping, or suppressed, or simply waiting for someone who could match its intensity. And Dante, with all his darkness and danger and devastating control, had awakened something in me that couldn't be put back to sleep, had called to the parts of myself I had always tried to ignore or minimize because they didn't fit the image of who I thought I should be. My return to Dante's world was not as a captive or an obligation, but as something else entirely, something I chose with open eyes and full understanding of what that choice meant. And I discovered that there was strange freedom in surrendering to the truth of who I actually was, rather than who I thought I should be, in accepting that I was drawn to darkness and power, and the kind of man who would burn down the world to keep me safe. I took my place at Dante's side officially, learning not just to observe his empire but to participate in it, discovering that I had a talent for strategy and negotiation that surprised even myself, that my art history background gave me unexpected insights into the psychology of the wealthy collectors and investors who formed part of Dante's legitimate business operations, and that the empathy I had always considered a weakness could actually be a powerful tool when deployed correctly in a world where most people operated purely from self-interest. The organization that had once seemed so foreign and frightening became familiar territory, and I found myself commanding respect in my own right, rather than simply as an extension of Dante's power. proving through careful maneuvering and occasional ruthlessness that I wasn't just decoration or a weakness to be exploited, but rather an asset and a force to be reckoned with in my own capacity. Dante watched this transformation with what I could only describe as pride mixed with desire, seeing me become the woman he had somehow known I could be, and our relationship evolved beyond the initial claiming into something deeper and more complex, built on genuine partnership and mutual respect, alongside the intense physical attraction that had always crackled between us. And I learned that love in his world looked different than the fairy tales I had grown up believing, that it was expressed through protection and loyalty and the willingness to destroy anyone who threatened what you had built together. And I found that I preferred this darker, more honest version of devotion to the pretty lies more conventional relationships were built upon. Our wedding, when it finally happened, was less a celebration and more a declaration of power to everyone who mattered in New York's criminal underworld. A lavish affair that brought together both legitimate society and the darker forces that moved beneath the surface. And as I stood beside Dante wearing a dress that had been custom-made by a designer who probably didn't want to know exactly who was paying for her services, I thought about the terrified girl I had been just months ago, drowning in debt and desperation, believing that Christian's proposal represented salvation from a life that was crushing me under its weight. I had been so wrong about what salvation looked like, had been searching for rescue in the form of stability and normalcy, and a return to the life I thought I should want, when what I actually needed was someone who would see through all my defenses to the person underneath. Someone who would claim me so completely that I had no choice but to finally claim myself in return. Someone who would love me not despite my darkness, but because of it. Because he recognized it as matching his own. As Dante slid the wedding ring onto my finger, replacing the engagement ring Christian had offered in what felt like a lifetime ago, I looked into his eyes and saw reflected back everything I had become. All the ways I had transformed from that desperate graduate student into someone who could stand confidently in this dangerous, beautiful, terrible world. And I realized that what had seemed like losing myself was actually finding myself. That being claimed by Dante Valentino had forced me to stop pretending to be someone I wasn't and start embracing who I actually was. And the freedom in that acceptance was worth every sacrifice and every moment of fear and uncertainty I had endured to get here. The reception flowed around us in a glittering display of wealth and power. People who controlled empires and moved millions with a word coming to pay their respects and acknowledge our union. And I received them with the confidence of someone who had earned her place rather than simply been granted it. And I knew that I would defend this life, this man, this world we were building together with the same ruthlessness he had shown in claiming me. Because I understood now that love in the darkness wasn't weaker than love in the light. It was simply more honest about the cost and more willing to pay it. In the end, standing in Dante's arms as we swayed to music played by an orchestra that probably cost more than my entire previous year's salary, surrounded by dangerous people wearing beautiful masks of civilization, I understood that there are 1,000 different kinds of love stories, and not all of them look like what we're told they should. And some of the deepest, truest connections are forged not in sunshine and easy happiness, but in shadow and struggle, and the willingness to see someone's darkness and say yes anyway. To look at all the broken, dangerous, beautiful pieces of a person, and decide that this, exactly this, is what you choose, is what you'll fight for, is what you'll burn the world down to protect. And as Dante pressed his lips to my temple, and whispered that I was his queen, his partner, his equal, his everything, I knew with absolute certainty that I had found exactly where I belonged, had become exactly who I was always meant to be, had discovered that sometimes being taken is really just another word for being freed, and that the greatest love stories aren't about being saved, but about being seen, completely and utterly seen, and being loved not despite what that seeing reveals, but because of it. Because sometimes the only person who can truly love you is the one whose demons dance perfectly with your own, whose darkness understands your darkness, whose soul recognizes your soul as its mirror and its match, and in that recognition, in that perfect, terrible, beautiful understanding, you finally, irrevocably, devastatingly, come home.